The sky over Dustwater County had turned the color of a fresh bruise. It was a vile, sickly green that promised violence, a color that made the hair on a man's arm stand up and sent prairie dogs diving for the deepest burrows. Maybelline Crane felt the change in the pit of her stomach. It was the same unease she felt when a coyote pack got too bold, a low thrum of warning that vibrated right up through the soles of her worn boots. For 2 years since Samuel's passing, she had learned to read the land's moods as intimately as she had once read her husband's face. This mood was a foul one. The wind began its low moan, a prelude to a scream. It whipped her calico dress against her legs and stole the pins from the tight bun at the nape of her neck, freeing strands of brown hair to lash at her cheeks. In the distance, the single bell atop the Dustwater meeting house began to clang, a frantic, desperate rhythm that was not a call to worship but a cry of alarm. A twister was coming. Her first thought was Jasper. Her steady, aging gelding stood in the small paddock, his head up, nostrils flared, smelling the ozone in the air. He was her plow horse, her transportation, her only companion on the long, quiet evenings. He was everything. "Easy, boy," she called, her voice snatched away by the rising gale. She unlatched the paddock gate and grabbed his bridle, tugging him toward the relative safety of the small, sturdy barn Samuel had built with his own hands. The air was thick now, heavy with the scent of rain and torn earth. Jasper fought her, his eyes wide with animal terror, his big body trembling. He did not want to be confined. His instinct was to run, to outpace the storm on the open plain. She had just gotten him to the barn door when a flicker of movement near the fence line caught her eye. It was not the frantic scuttling of a rabbit or the tumble of a weed. It was a patch of darkness, a shape that did not belong. She squinted against the dust. A man. He was lying crumpled against the split rail fence, a heap of dark duster and denim. He was unnervingly still. The wind tore at her, a physical force trying to push her back. The barn bell's clang grew more insistent, a frantic heartbeat against the roar. Save the horse, latch him in the stall. That was the sensible thing. That was the only thing to do. A horse was survival. A stranger was a risk. And in this part of Kansas Territory in the spring of 1884, a risk was often the last thing a body took. But he was not moving, and even from 50 feet away, she could see the dark stain spreading from his temple into his hair. A terrible, instant choice stood before her, the horse or the man, her livelihood or a life. Maybelline slapped Jasper hard on the rump, a resounding crack that sent him bolting not into the barn, but away from it, toward the open, rolling hills to the east. "Go!" she screamed into the wind, a prayer and a command. "Run, you old fool." He would have to trust his own legs. She would have to trust a stranger. She ran, leaning into the wind that fought to throw her down. The man was heavy, solidly built. His face was turned to the dirt, pale and stubbled. The cut on his forehead was deep, bleeding sluggishly. His coat, a good quality duster, was torn at the shoulder. He was breathing, a shallow, ragged sound. She hooked her hands under his arms and pulled. It was like trying to move a felled tree. He was dead weight, all limp muscle and bone. "Come on," she grunted, digging her heels into the dry soil. "You are not dying on my fence line. I have enough trouble." She dragged him, step by agonizing step, across the yard. The sky was darkening with every second, the green deepening to a murky, apocalyptic twilight. Debris began to fly past them, leaves, twigs, then a loose shingle from her own roof. The storm cellar was her only hope. Its angled doors were set into a small rise a few yards from the farmhouse porch. It was her larder, her sanctuary, her tomb if the storm was bad enough. She heaved him down the 3 stone steps, his boots thudding against the packed earth floor. She tumbled in after him, slamming the thick oak doors shut just as the world outside erupted into a deafening freight train roar. She fumbled for the thick crossbar and dropped it into its iron brackets. A split second later, A tremendous impact struck the doors, making the entire small space shudder. The wood groaned. The iron brackets screamed. It felt as if the hand of God itself was trying to rip the doors from their hinges. She scrambled back, her heart hammering against her ribs, and fumbled in the dark for the lantern and matches she always kept on the shelf. Her hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to strike a flame. The wick caught, and a warm, steady glow pushed back the absolute blackness. The cellar smelled of damp earth, potatoes, and her canned peaches from the summer before. The roar outside was a physical presence, a pressure on her ears and bones. The lantern light flickered, casting their shadows, huge and distorted, against the stone walls. The man was stirring. He moaned, a low sound of pure pain, and his eyelids fluttered. In the soft lamplight, she could see his face more clearly. He was not old, maybe 30 or so. His features were strong, clean-shaven except for a few days of dark stubble. Even with the dirt and the blood, there was something refined about his face, a firmness in the jaw that spoke of command. His eyes opened, unfocused and clouded with confusion. They were a deep blue, the color of a dusk sky after a clear day. He tried to sit up, then fell back with a gasp. "Where?" His voice was a dry rasp. "Storm cellar," Maybelline said, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady. "There is a tornado. You were by my fence." He looked at her, his gaze struggling to focus. He seemed to be looking through her more than at her. He blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, as if trying to clear a fog from his mind. "McCrae," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the storm's fury. "Colt McCrae." Maybelline filed the name away. Colt McCrae. It meant nothing to her, but a man ought to have a name, even if he was a stranger who fell out of a storm onto her land. She tore a strip from the hem of her spare apron, dampened it with water from her canteen, and gently began to clean the blood from his temple. He flinched, but did not pull away. The roar outside lessened, then rose again, punctuated by the sharp crack of splintering wood. It was her barn, or the house. She pushed the thought away. There was nothing to be done but wait. In the flickering light of the lantern, trapped beneath the rage of the Kansas sky, she and the man named Colt McCrae waited for the world to be born again. The silence, when it finally came, was more jarring than the noise. It was a dead, profound quiet, broken only by the drip of water somewhere nearby. Maybelline counted to 100, slowly before she dared to move. She lifted the heavy crossbar and pushed. The door swung open to a world remade. The sky was a placid, washed-out blue, innocent as a newborn. But the land was a ruin. Her barn had been torn in half, its contents scattered across the field. The roof of her small farmhouse was missing a wide section, looking like a mouth with teeth knocked out. The ancient cottonwood by the creek was gone, reduced to a splintered stump, and the creek itself was no longer a creek. It was a churning brown river, swollen and angry, and the small wooden bridge that connected her property to the road to Dustwater was simply gone, erased. She and Colt McCrae were utterly, completely alone. For 3 days, they lived on an island of wreckage. The man's memory was a tattered cloth. He knew his name was Colt, but little else. When she asked where he came from or where he was going, a look of pained confusion would cross his face, and he would press his fingers to his injured temple as if trying to physically force the thoughts back into place. He was polite, quiet, and possessed a strength that returned quickly as the days of his injury faded. He worked without complaint, helping her salvage what they could from the barn and patch the hole in her roof with loose boards. Maybelline watched him. She trusted the goodness in people, for the most part, but she was not a fool. Her husband had not left her a fool. Her double-barreled shotgun was never far from her reach. At night, she propped it against the wall by her cot, while Colt slept on a bedroll by the hearth. He never gave her a moment's cause for fear. He moved with a quiet competence, his hands sure and steady as he worked. There was a coiled stillness about him, the economy of motion of a man who was used to his body and what it could do. Yet, there was also a vulnerability, a lostness in his eyes that disarmed her more than any threat could have. Sometimes, she would see him standing by the raging creek, staring at the place where the bridge used to be, his brow furrowed in concentration. He would stay that way for an hour at a time, silent and motionless. She wondered what ghosts he was wrestling with. For Colt, the world inside his head was a far more chaotic landscape than the one outside. His mind was a locked room, and the only things that slipped through the keyhole were fragments, sharp and meaningless as shards of glass. He would be splitting wood, and the scent of the pine would trigger a flash of memory, the smell of campfire smoke, thick and resinous, mingled with the metallic tang of fear. He would see her horse, Jasper, who had miraculously returned the next morning, muddy but unharmed, and be struck by a vision of hoofbeats, dozens of them, pounding the earth in a frantic rhythm. Once, while she was cleaning the shotgun, the sharp click of the hammer being cocked sent a jolt through him. A single, deafening gunshot echoed in his skull, followed by an all-consuming, terrifying blackness. He would stumble, gasping, the sweat cold on his brow, and the memory would be gone, leaving only its phantom ache behind. He could not connect the pieces. They were just slivers of a life he could not claim. On the third day, the water had receded enough that they could begin planning a more permanent repair for the roof. Maybelline needed to measure a length for a new support beam. "We need a piece of wood about so long," she said, holding her hands apart. "But it needs to be exact." Colt picked up a long, straight piece of salvaged timber. "Mark it," he said. She looked around for something to write with. He saw her searching and picked up a small piece of charcoal from the fire pit. He handed her the charcoal and held the board steady for her. "Go on," he prompted gently. "No, you do it," she said, her hands full with a measuring tape. "Just there. Make a good, clear line." He took the charcoal. He knelt, resting the board on his knee. He made the mark she indicated, a clean, dark line. Then, for a reason he could not have explained, a motion born of pure, unthinking habit, his hand kept moving. Beside the mark, his fingers formed a name, the muscle and sinew remembering a pattern his mind had lost. The letters flowed from the charcoal, sharp and elegant, a signature of confident, looping script that looked strangely out of place on the rough, splintered wood. "McCrae." He stared at it, a flicker of something, a ghost of familiarity, touching him for a second before vanishing. He looked up at Maybelline. She was completely still, the tape measure dangling forgotten from her hand. Her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on the name written on the board. Her breath had caught in her throat, a sharp, audible hitch. He had seen that look before, on the faces of people in his fragmented dreams. But this was real. This was the quiet, capable woman who had saved his life, and she was looking at the name on that board as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She knew that signature. Everyone in Dustwater County knew it. She had seen it stenciled on the side of every sack of flour in the general store. It was branded onto the crates of tools and printed on the labels of the finest seed. It was the name that owned the largest ranches, the richest bottomland, and, some whispered, the county council itself. It was a name that meant power, a name that belonged to a world of iron gates and sprawling mansions, a world so far from her own hard-scrabble existence that it might as well have been on the moon. The man she had pulled from the mud, the quiet stranger with lost eyes sleeping by her fire, was the man who owned half the world she knew, and he had no idea. The charcoal signature lay on the wood like a brand. For a long moment, the only sound was the sigh of the prairie wind through the broken bones of her farmhouse. Maybelline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze. The world had shifted under her feet. The man before her was no longer just Colt, a lost soul washed up by a storm. He was McCrae. The name itself felt heavy, a thing of substance and power that changed the very air between them. She took a half step back, an unconscious retreat. Her kindness, Her decision to risk her horse for a stranger suddenly felt naive. She had not saved a drifter. She had pulled the king of the county from a ditch. The thought was so absurd it was almost laughable. But no laughter came. Only a cold, hard knot of apprehension in her belly. He saw the change in her face. The way the open concern in her eyes was replaced by a guarded, shuttered watchfulness. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Does the name mean something to you?" She could not lie. Not entirely. "It is a known name in these parts," she said, her tone carefully neutral. She picked up the tape measure, her movements suddenly stiff and deliberate. The easy familiarity they had built over 3 days of shared labor and survival had vanished, shattered by 10 letters scrawled in charcoal. In the days that followed, a strange and subtle dance began between them. Colt, still a man without a past, threw himself into the work of rebuilding. He was a tireless worker, his hands clever and his back strong. He rehung the barn door, his swings of the hammer steady and true. He mended the split rail fence with a neatness that spoke of long practice. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still quiet, still respectful, still looked at her with those lost blue eyes that seemed to be searching for an anchor. But Maybelline saw everything differently now. She saw the way he stood on the small rise behind her house, his hands on his hips, his gaze sweeping over her meager property not with the eyes of a helper, but with the assessing glance of a man who understood the value of every acre. She saw him watching Jasper graze and knew he was not just admiring the horse. He was calculating the animal's age by its teeth, judging the strength of its legs, weighing its worth. One afternoon, she found him by her small chicken coop, frowning. "They are laying thin shells," he said, without preamble. "They need more calcium. Crushed oyster shells in their feed." It was not a suggestion. It was a diagnosis, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had likely managed thousands of head of livestock. She felt a prickle of resentment. "I do what I can," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. He turned to her, and the authority in his expression was replaced by that familiar, frustrating confusion. "I am sorry," he said, shaking his head slightly as if to clear it. "I do not know why I said that. It just seemed right." He was a puzzle. He behaved with the humility of a hired hand, yet his instincts were those of a master. He could not remember his own home, but he could read the story of a dry season in the cracks of the earth. He could not recall a single friend's face, but he could estimate the board feet in a stand of timber with a single glance. It was as if his body and his gut remembered the life his mind had forgotten. The hands remembered the signature. The eyes remembered the land. The mind remembered nothing. This contradiction made him more of a mystery than when he was just a nameless man at her fence. It made him dangerous, not because of any threat he posed, but because of the vast, invisible chasm of station and wealth that now separated them. The rider appeared at dusk, a dark silhouette against a sky streaked with orange and purple. He rode a fine bay horse that moved with an easy, ground-covering stride. He was heading for the spot where the bridge had been, and he reined in his horse, surveying the flood-swollen creek with a frustrated air. He was a man in his 40s, lean and weathered, with a face that looked kind but resolute. He dismounted, and his eyes scanned the ruined farmstead, finally settling on the 2 figures near the patched-up house. Colt saw him first and stiffened, a flicker of something, not quite memory, but a kind of primal recognition. In his eyes, he put a hand on Maybelline's arm, a protective gesture. The man started toward them, his boots making soft sounds in the damp earth. "Hello, the house," he called, his voice clear and strong. "That is far enough," Maybelline answered, her hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun she kept leaning just inside the door. The man stopped, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I mean no harm. Ma'am, my name is Tom Wilkins. I am foreman for the McCrae Holdings. I am looking for my boss." His eyes fixed on Colt, and his weathered face broke into a look of profound relief. "Found him. It seems... Boss, are you all right? We have had half the county out looking for you for 2 weeks, since the storm." Colt stared at the man. The name meant nothing. The face meant nothing. But the term boss landed like a stone in a still pond. "You have the wrong man," Colt said, his voice flat. Tom Wilkins took a few steps closer, his gaze full of concern. He looked at the healing gash on Colt's temple. "No, sir, I do not. You are Colt McCrae. Your father hired me on 20 years ago. I would know you anywhere." He gestured back across the creek. "The whole ranch is in an uproar. We thought, well, we feared the worst after we found your horse with an empty saddle." The confirmation hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Maybelline felt her last thread of doubt snap. It was true, all of it. Colt looked from Tom's earnest face to Maybelline's pale one. He saw the truth reflected there, in the way she held herself, in the new distance in her eyes. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he put a hand against the wall of the house to steady himself. "McCrae," he repeated, the name feeling like a foreign word in his own mouth. He was not just a man with a lost past, he was a man with a past so large it owned the very ground he stood on. The weight of it was suffocating. He felt a surge of something like panic, a desperate desire to deny it, to be just Colt, the man who fixed fences and slept by a widow's hearth. Tom Wilkins' gaze took in the state of Maybelline's farm, the gaping hole in the roof, the splintered remains of the barn. His expression softened with respect. "It seems we owe you a great debt, ma'am," he said to Maybelline. "You saved his life." Maybelline just nodded, unable to find her voice. "You cannot stay here," Tom continued, his tone practical. "It is not safe. You must come back to the main ranch with us. Mr. McCrae will want to see that you are taken care of, that your home is rebuilt proper." Pride, sharp and fierce, rose in Maybelline's throat. She was nobody's charity case. She had managed on her own for 2 years, and she would manage now. "I thank you for the offer, Mr. Wilkins, but this is my home. I will be fine." Please," a voice said. It was Colt. He had pushed himself away from the wall, and though his face was ashen, his eyes were clear and fixed on hers. The lost look was gone, replaced by a deep, pleading resolve. "Please, Maybelline, he is right. Look at this place. Let me do this. It is the only thing that feels right after what you did for me." It was the first time he had spoken with the weight of his name behind him. It was a request, but it was also a command. The gentle but undeniable pressure of a man accustomed to having his will done. She looked at her broken home, at the setting sun, and felt the bone-deep weariness of her struggle. To refuse would be foolish, an act of pride that would serve no one, least of all herself. The reality of her situation was a cold, hard fact. She was beaten, for now. She gave a single, tight nod. The journey to the McCrae Ranch was a passage into another world. They crossed the creek at a shallow ford a mile downstream, and soon the rough track from her farm met a wide, well-graded road. The land here was richer, the fences newer, the livestock fatter. As the sun sank completely, they crested a hill, and Maybelline saw the ranch house below. It was not just a house, it was a compound. A 2-story structure of white-painted wood with a wide veranda, surrounded by a constellation of barns, bunkhouses, and corrals. All of it lit by the warm yellow glow of dozens of lanterns. It was less a farm and more a fortress. A pair of massive wrought-iron gates blocked the main drive. A man emerged from a small gatehouse and swung them open at the sight of Tom and Colt. They rode through, and the gates clanged shut behind them with a sound of finality, like a vault being sealed. Maybelline felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her, ranch hands, stopping their evening chores. Stared at the woman in the worn calico dress riding beside the boss. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were cold and assessing. She felt her worn dress and dusty boots like a brand of shame. They dismounted in front of the main house. The front door opened, spilling a rectangle of bright light onto the porch. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was tall and slender, her graying hair pinned in an immaculate chignon. Her dress was of fine, dark wool, severe and elegant. As she stepped forward into the lantern light, Maybelline saw her face. She was perhaps 55, with features that had once been beautiful and had now hardened into a kind of handsome severity. She moved with an unshakable poise, her back ramrod straight. "Colt," the woman breathed, her voice a mixture of immense relief and stern disapproval. She moved toward him, but stopped short of an embrace, instead placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "We have been sick with worry. Where have you been?" "It is a long story, Josephine," Tom Wilkins said quietly. "He took a bad knock on the head. His memory is gone." The woman's eyes, a cool, calculating gray, flicked from Colt to Maybelline, taking in every detail of her worn dress, her wind-tangled hair, her calloused hands. A smile touched her lips, but it did not reach her eyes. It was a smile of perfect, chilly politeness, a social gesture as sharp and thin as a shard of glass. "I see," she said, her voice smooth as cream but cold as ice. "Welcome to McCrae Holdings, Miss Crane," Maybelline supplied, forcing herself to meet the woman's gaze. "Maybelline Crane." "Miss Crane," Josephine repeated, the name sounding like an unfortunate specimen on her tongue. "We are so very grateful you found our Mr. McCrae. It must have been quite an ordeal for you." Stepping through the front door of the McCrae house was like stepping into a different country. Maybelline's world was one of raw wood, packed earth, and the constant shifting light of the open sky. This world was one of shadows and polish, a grand staircase of dark. Gleaming wood curved up into the gloom of the second floor. The air was still and cool, smelling faintly of beeswax and dried roses, a stark contrast to the scent of dust and sweat that clung to her own clothes. A tall clock in the hall ticked with a solemn, heavy beat, measuring out a time that felt slower and more significant than the frantic rhythm of survival she was used to. Josephine led her to a room upstairs. It was larger than Maybelline's entire cabin. The bed was a mountain of white linen and soft quilts, with a headboard carved into the shape of overlapping leaves. A porcelain basin and pitcher, painted with tiny blue flowers, sat on a marble-topped washstand. Everything was clean, quiet, and suffocating. The luxury of it was a weight, a physical pressure that made her feel clumsy and coarse. It was an unspoken accusation against her chapped hands and the mended tear in her sleeve. Colt was taken away by Tom Wilkins to see a doctor who had been summoned from town. When he returned an hour later, he looked different. He was wearing clean clothes that had been laid out for him, a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. The clothes fit him with a casual perfection that spoke of a tailor's hand. He had bathed and shaved, and the clean line of his jaw was more pronounced, more authoritative. He was still the man she had pulled from the mud, but the shell of the powerful man he had been was reforming around him, back in his own territory, surrounded by his own possessions. The master of the house was beginning to re-emerge, whether his memory was there or not. He found her standing awkwardly in the middle of the grand room. "They are giving you this room?" he asked, his brow furrowed slightly. "It is a bit formal. I'm sorry, Josephine has her ways." The use of the housekeeper's first name, the casual critique of her arrangements, was a small thing, but it was a clear sign of his station. He was not a guest here. He was the center of this universe. "It is very generous," Maybelline said, her voice sounding small in the vast room. That evening, dinner was an ordeal. Josephine had decided it was a suitable occasion for a formal meal. 2 other couples from neighboring ranches had been invited, summoned on short notice to celebrate the master's return. They were the landed gentry of Dustwater County, people whose names were on deeds and banknotes. Maybelline, in a simple gray dress borrowed from a servant at Josephine's insistence, felt like a sparrow that had wandered into a cage of peacocks. The table was a battlefield of gleaming silver and fragile porcelain. The conversation was a low murmur of cattle prices, railroad disputes, and town gossip, all of it a foreign language to her. Colt sat at the head of the table, quiet and watchful. He seemed to be listening not just to the words, but to the undercurrents, trying to find his place in a life that was supposedly his own. A young woman named Martha Pike, whose husband owned the sprawling ranch to the south, turned her sharp, bird-like eyes on Maybelline. She had a smile that was all teeth. It must have been quite an adventure. "Miss Crane," she said, her voice carrying across the table, "to find a man like Mr. McCrae practically on your doorstep. Some people have all the luck." The implication was as clear as it was venomous that Maybelline was a fortunate opportunist, a scavenger who had stumbled upon a prize. The table fell quiet. All eyes turned to her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Her first instinct was to shrink, to murmur something polite and meaningless. But then she thought of her ruined home, of the terror of the storm, of the choice she had made between her horse and this man's life. The simple, brutal truth of it rose in her, and she spoke it. There was not much luck in it. "Mrs. Pike," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The luck was that I found him before he bled to death by my fence. The luck was that my storm cellar doors held. There is nothing lucky about losing your barn and half your roof." She looked directly at the other woman, her gaze unflinching. "But I suppose you are right. It was lucky for him that I value a man's life more than a horse's." A stunned silence descended upon the dining room. Martha Pike's perfect smile froze and then dissolved. One of the men coughed into his napkin. Colt looked at Maybelline, and for the first time since they had arrived, she saw a flicker of the man she had known in the cellar, a look of profound, unadorned gratitude. Josephine's face, however, had become a mask of cold fury. The following morning, Maybelline came down for breakfast to find a single place set for her at the long, empty dining table. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. As she sat, her hand brushed against the fine porcelain plate. Underneath it, tucked neatly against the rim, was a small, folded piece of paper. It had not been there a moment before. Someone had placed it there with deliberate care. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The writing was a harsh, angry scrawl. 4 words. "Leave. Dustwater does not welcome parasites." The message was a physical blow. It was one thing to feel the unspoken contempt of the wealthy, another entirely to have it delivered as a secret, venomous threat. She quickly folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket, her appetite gone. She felt a cold dread spread through her. She was an intruder here, and someone wanted her gone, badly. Colt found her on the veranda, staring out at the vast, orderly landscape of the ranch. He could feel the tension in the house. He could not remember the people or the routines, but he could sense the currents of resentment and hostility as clearly as he could feel the morning sun on his face. He saw the way the servant's eyes followed Maybelline, the stiff formality in Josephine's every word to her. This place, his supposed home, felt toxic. "This is not right," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The way they are treating you." "I am fine," she lied. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You are not. I brought you into this." He looked out at the rolling hills. "The storm did a lot of damage in the valley, to a lot of people less fortunate than your dinner guests last night. I want to help." He turned to her, a new determination in his eyes. "I need to see the account books, the ledgers. I want to set up a fund, a relief effort. Use McCrae resources to provide lumber, seed, whatever people need to rebuild." The idea was a lifeline, a way to make sense of the power he apparently wielded. It was an instinct, the same instinct that knew how to mend a fence or judge the health of an animal. It was the instinct of a leader. Later that day, he made the request in the ranch office, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and old paper. Josephine was there, as was a man she introduced as Emmett Kessler, the new foreman who had taken over after Tom Wilkins had been moved to manage the horse breeding operation. Kessler was a large man, with a florid face and small, watchful eyes. He smiled too much. When Colt asked for the ledgers, Josephine's polite mask tightened. "Colt, you must not trouble yourself with such things," she said, her voice laced with a sweet, patronizing concern. "You have had a terrible shock. The doctor said you need to rest. Emmett and I have everything perfectly in hand." "I am not an invalid." "Josephine," Colt said, his tone sharper than he intended, "I want to see the books." A look passed between Josephine and Kessler, a fleeting glance of shared strategy, with a show of reluctance. Kessler retrieved 3 thick, leather-bound volumes from a large safe and placed them on the massive oak desk. For the next few hours, Colt sat at that desk, the scent of old ink and money filling his nostrils. At first, the columns of numbers were just a meaningless scrawl, but slowly, as he forced himself to concentrate, patterns began to emerge. His fingers traced the lines of entries, and a deep, buried part of his brain began to wake up. He asked Maybelline to join him, thinking her practical knowledge might help. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an entry from the month before the storm. "An order for 500 feet of barbed wire. The price is nearly double what it should be." Maybelline leaned closer. "And look here," she said, her finger finding another line item, "a bill for a new water pump for the North Pasture. But Samuel and I helped old Mr. Henderson install a brand new pump there last fall. His was the finest in the county." They kept looking. They found invoices for ghost supplies, things that were never delivered. They found duplicate payments for taxes on parcels of land that Colt did not recognize. They found wages paid to ranch hands who had left the county years ago. The books were a work of fiction, a carefully constructed lie designed to bleed the McCrae holdings dry. And on nearly every falsified invoice, every padded expense report, was the same authorizing signature, a confident, flowing script that was not his own. The name repeated over and over, a drumbeat of deceit. Emmett Kessler. Colt leaned back in the chair, the scale of the deception settling on him like a physical weight. This was not just mismanagement. This was a systematic robbery, carried out right under his nose. And Josephine, with her fierce protectiveness of the books, had to know. She had to be a part of it. That afternoon, as Maybelline was walking through the quiet, tomb-like hall, Josephine appeared from the parlor. She was no longer wearing the cold, polite mask from the day before. Her expression was something different now, something harder and more direct. The pretense of hospitality had been stripped away. "Miss Crane," Josephine said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "I was just about to have some tea. Please, join me." It was not an invitation. It was a summons. Her eyes were chips of gray flint, and in their depths, Maybelline saw a clear, unmistakable warning. The battle for this house, and for the man who owned it, had just begun. The room Josephine led her to was called the Sun Parlor. It was a small space enclosed in glass on 3 sides, filled with wicker furniture and an abundance of ferns that thrived in the bright, warm light. It should have been a cheerful room, but with Josephine as its occupant, it felt like a beautifully constructed trap. A silver tea service, gleaming and ornate, already sat on a low table. 2 delicate porcelain cups were waiting. Maybelline sat stiffly on the edge of a wicker chair that creaked under her weight. She felt a powerful urge to flee, to run out of this house and back to her own broken but honest piece of land. But she was cornered. To refuse this tea would be an open declaration of war, and she was not yet sure what kind of weapons her enemy possessed. Josephine moved with a fluid, unhurried grace, her dark wool dress making no sound. She picked up the silver teapot. "It is a difficult position you find yourself in." "Miss Crane," she said, her voice a soft, conversational murmur. She did not look at Maybelline, focusing instead on the stream of amber liquid she poured into a cup. To be thrust into a world that is not your own, it can be disorienting. She placed the first cup, the one she had just poured, in front of Maybelline. Maybelline glanced down at it. The tea was not clear. It was slightly cloudy, with a faint, milky turbidity that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Some people, Josephine continued, pouring her own tea, which was a perfectly clear, rich brown, are born to a certain place in the world. They understand its rules, its obligations. Others are not. When those others try to occupy a place that was not meant for them, they create disorder. They become a problem that needs to be tidied up. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting Maybelline's. The smile was gone. There was nothing left but a cold, placid certainty. A person should always know their place. Do you not agree? The threat was no longer veiled. It was as plain and solid as the table between them. Maybelline's hand was frozen, hovering over the murky cup. Her mind screamed at her not to drink, but her pride, her refusal to show fear, was a powerful, stubborn thing. She would not be chased away like a stray dog. She wrapped her fingers around the delicate handle of the cup. She raised it halfway to her lips, then paused. The smell was faintly bitter, an acrid note underneath the pleasant aroma of bergamot. It was the scent of crushed leaves, of something from the earth that did not belong in a teacup. And then the feeling began. It started not in her stomach, but in her chest, a strange, spreading warmth that was deeply unpleasant. It climbed, a hot, tight band constricting around her lungs, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Her vision began to swim, the bright sunlight fracturing into 1,000 dazzling, painful points of light. The pattern on Josephine's dress seemed to ripple and writhe. The room tilted. A wave of dizziness, profound and overwhelming, rose from her chest into her throat. Her grip on the teacup went slack. It fell from her fingers, striking the floor with a sharp, shattering crack. Brown liquid and white porcelain shards sprayed across the polished wood. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden, ringing silence. Through a darkening tunnel of vision, she saw Josephine's face, impassive, watching her fall. The parlor door burst open. Colt stood there, his face a mask of thunder. He must have been walking down the hall, must have heard the crash. He took in the scene in a single, lightning-fast glance. Maybelline slumping in her chair, her face a ghastly white, the shattered cup at her feet, and Josephine, standing by the tea service, perfectly composed. He did not waste a second on questions. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, bypassing Josephine as if she were a piece of furniture. He knelt beside Maybelline, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Maybelline, what is it? What is wrong?" She could not answer. Her tongue was thick and heavy in her mouth. She could only look at him, her eyes wide with a terror she could no longer hide. With a low growl of fury, he scooped her up into his arms. She was startlingly light. He held her against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He turned toward the door, then stopped, his body rigid. He looked back at Josephine, and the cold rage in his eyes made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "Get the doctor," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." He carried her up the grand staircase as if she weighed nothing at all and laid her gently on the mountain of linen in her room. He did not leave her side. A servant girl came, her face pale with fright, and he sent her for cool water and cloths. When the doctor finally arrived, a harried, balding man from town, Colt stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, watching every move. The doctor examined Maybelline, listened to her fluttering heart, and peered into her eyes. He was baffled. He finally gave her a simple sleeping draught, declaring it a case of nervous exhaustion, a common ailment among women of delicate constitution. Colt knew it was a lie. There was nothing delicate about Maybelline's constitution. She was strong as prairie sod. This was not exhaustion. This was an attack. After the doctor left, Colt went in search of Josephine. He found her in the office, calmly reviewing a stock report with Emmett Kessler. who immediately made himself scarce. "What was in that tea?" Colt asked, his voice deceptively quiet. Josephine looked up from her papers, her expression one of mild surprise. "I have no idea what you are talking about." The girl fainted. It was all very dramatic. "She did not faint," Colt said, stepping closer to the desk, placing his hands flat on the polished wood. "I saw the cup. I smelled it. You tried to hurt her." Josephine did not flinch. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady and unwavering. She did not admit to anything, but she did not deny the heart of his accusation. "I have spent my entire life protecting this family," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I looked after your mother until the day she died in this very house. I raised you when she was gone. Everything I do to protect the McCrae name and the legacy your father built." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glittering. "I will not stand by and watch a grifting little homesteader with dirt under her nails tear it all down because you have a hole in your memory. I will clean up any trouble that threatens this house, any trouble at all." It was a confession, wrapped in the language of loyalty. Colt stared at her, seeing for the first time not the woman who had managed his father's house, but a zealot, a guardian of a legacy who believed that any action was justified in its defense. There was no reaching her. He spent the night in a chair pulled up beside Maybelline's bed. The sleeping draught had taken her into a deep, troubled sleep. She tossed and turned, murmuring things he could not understand. He kept a cool cloth on her forehead, and when she woke for a few moments, parched and confused, he was there with a glass of water, helping her drink. In the small, quiet hours before dawn, her eyes fluttered open. The confusion was gone, replaced by a weary clarity. The room was dark, save for the single lantern he had left burning low on the washstand. "You are still here," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I am not leaving you," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. She was quiet for a long time. "I am afraid," she finally admitted, so softly he had to lean closer to hear. "Of her." "Of this," she said, a small gesture of her hand taking in the opulent room, the grand house, the whole impossible world she had fallen into. "This is not my life. I do not belong here." He took her hand. It felt small and fragile in his own. "When I woke up in your cellar," he said, his voice low and intense, "I did not know who I was. I still do not. Every face in this house is a stranger to me. Every room is a memory I cannot find. The only thing that has felt real, the only thing that has felt true since that storm, is you." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "You are the only home I can remember." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Her recovery was slow. For 2 days, she was too weak to leave the bed. Colt stayed with her, taking his meals on a tray in her room, deflecting all of Josephine's attempts to see her. He read to her from a book of poems he found in the library, his voice a low, steady rumble that soothed her more than any medicine. In the quiet companionship of the sick room, the fragile trust they had built in the storm cellar was reforged, stronger now, tempered by shared danger and whispered confessions. On the 3rd day, she was strong enough to walk out onto the 2nd-floor balcony that overlooked the front drive. She was still pale, still shaky, but the prairie air felt good on her skin. Colt stood beside her, a protective presence. "I should go back to my farm," she said, though the words held no conviction. "No," he said immediately. "You are not safe there alone, and you are not safe here. Not really." He looked at her, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. "But I will not let her drive you away. I will not let any of them." He put his hand on the balcony railing, his knuckles white. "I swear this to you, Maybelline. I would tear this house down brick by brick if you walked out of it in fear." The promise was a vow, a shield he placed around her. For the first time since she had seen his signature on that piece of wood, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was a place for her in his world after all. Miles away, in the dusty county seat of Dustwater, Emmett Kessler sat in a saloon, buying a round of drinks for 2 members of the county council. He spoke in a low, concerned voice about the tragic events at the McCrae Ranch. He painted a picture of a man unmoored from his senses, a man suffering from delusions, making wild accusations, his mind shattered by a terrible blow to the head. It was a tragedy, Kessler said, a true tragedy. For the good of the county, for the stability of the McCrae holdings, something had to be done. Later that afternoon, Emmett Kessler filed a formal, sealed petition with the county clerk. It was an application for emergency conservatorship, requesting that the assets and affairs of Colt McCrae be placed under temporary legal guardianship, on the grounds that the man was mentally incompetent and a danger to himself and his own vast fortune. 2 days before the world was set to break again, Colt woke in the gray pre-dawn light with the walls of the great house pressing in on him. He felt a desperate, primal need for open space, for a sky that was not framed by a window pane. The house was a prison of memories that were not his, a place of whispers and secrets where the very air was thick with a past he could not grasp. He dressed quietly in the dark, pulling on the simple, sturdy clothes he had come to prefer over the fine shirts and trousers laid out for him. He found Maybelline in the kitchen, already awake, staring into a cup of coffee she had made for herself. She looked as trapped as he felt. The shadows under her eyes told him she had not been sleeping well either. The house was a constant threat, a place where even a cup of tea could be a weapon. "Ride with me," he said, his voice quiet in the still room. It was not a question. It was a plea. "Away from here, just for the morning." She looked up at him, and in her tired eyes, he saw the same yearning he felt. She nodded without a word. They saddled the horses themselves in the chill of the morning, their movements synchronized in the quiet companionship of the barn. Tom Wilkins watched them from a distance with a sad, knowing look, but said nothing. They rode out not through the great iron gates, but through a smaller pasture gate to the west, leaving the imposing ranch house and its silent intrigues behind them. The air was cold and clean, carrying the sharp, earthy scent of the plains waking up. They rode for nearly an hour in a comfortable silence, climbing steadily toward a high, rocky knoll that stood like a lone sentinel overlooking the entire valley. From the top, the world spread out below them. To the east lay the McCrae holdings, an orderly kingdom of white fences and massive barns. To the south, much smaller and humbler, was her own small farmstead, a tiny, wounded patch on the vast quilt of the prairie. The sight of it, with its patched roof and broken barn, sent a pang of guilt and protectiveness through Colt. It was a visible reminder of what she had risked for him. They dismounted and tied the horses to a gnarled, wind-scoured juniper tree. A brisk wind swept across the knoll, and Maybelline hugged her arms to her chest. "It is cold up here," she said. "We will build a fire," Colt answered. It was a simple task, a familiar ritual that connected him to the man he had been on her farm, a man with no name, but with a purpose. They gathered dry branches of sagebrush, the leaves a pale, silvery green. He arranged them in a small clearing between the rocks, and with a match from his pocket, he set them alight. The fire caught quickly, and the air was filled with the clean, purifying scent of burning sage. They sat on a flat-topped boulder, their shoulders nearly touching, holding their hands out to the small, bright flame. The fire crackled, a cheerful sound in the immense quiet of the high place. "He would have liked this," Maybelline said softly, her eyes on the flames. "Samuel?" Colt waited. He knew, instinctively, that this was a door she was opening for the first time. "He was a quiet man," she continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Not a great talker, but he saw things. He saw me. Not just as a wife to cook and clean and mend, but as me. He used to say I was tougher than any man he knew, and he said it with pride, not as an insult." She looked over at Colt, her gaze direct and clear. "He chose me, and he let me be who I was. That is a rare thing. Colt felt a strange, painful echo in his own chest, a phantom limb of a memory. The word chosa snagged on something sharp inside him. He saw a flash in his mind, a stern, bearded face, eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. His father. The memory was not a picture so much as a feeling, a heavy, suffocating weight of expectation. He had not been chosen for who he was. He had been a vessel, an heir, a continuation of a name, the McCrae, not Colt. "My father," he began, the words coming slowly, hesitantly, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, dark well. I cannot see his face clearly, but I can feel him. He was hard, a hard man. Nothing was ever good enough. The fences were not straight enough, the cattle not heavy enough, the profits not high enough. He looked at his own hands, turning them over as if they belonged to a stranger. I think I spent my whole life trying to earn his approval, and never getting it. He did not want a son. He wanted a better version of himself. He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was absolute. "You were chosen for who you are. I was chosen for what I would inherit." The wind sighed around them, carrying the scent of sage and the immense loneliness of the prairie. In that moment, on that high, wind-swept knoll, they were not the powerful rancher and the poor widow. They were just a man and a woman, each scarred by their past, each yearning for the simple, profound grace of being seen for themselves. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning the brown to a warm, liquid gold. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool from the morning air, her skin calloused from work, but her hand fit in his as if it were made to be there. He did not say anything. He just held it, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of her breathing, which had grown a little faster. She turned to him fully, her body shifting on the rock. The space between them disappeared. He could feel the warmth of her, see the fine lines around her eyes, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. She was not a classic beauty like the women he had seen at the dinner table. She was something far more real. Her face a map of strength, sorrow, and a deep, unwavering kindness. She leaned in, her forehead coming to rest against his cheek. Her skin was soft. He could feel the fine strands of her hair tickling his temple. He closed his eyes, breathing in her scent, a mix of wood smoke and soap and the clean prairie air. The whole world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact. A small, shuddering breath escaped her lips. "I want you so bad," she whispered, the words a raw, honest confession against his skin. The sound of it, the pure, undisguised longing in her voice, broke through the last of his defenses. This was not about a name or a legacy. This was about this woman. Here, now. This was real. His response was not a rush of passion, but an act of deliberate, reverent tenderness. He did not grab her or pull her closer. Instead, his free hand came up, and his fingers, gentle as a breath, began to trace the line of her jaw. He moved with an infinite slowness, as if he were memorizing her. His fingertips trailed from her jaw to the delicate hollow of her throat, where he could feel the frantic beat of her pulse. He followed the elegant line of her collarbone, and then, taking the hand he held, he turned it over and traced the fine, blue veins on the inside of her wrist. With every slow, deliberate touch, he could feel a tremor run through her. He was not just touching her skin, he was touching her soul, writing a silent promise on her with his hands, a language of pure feeling that needed no words. He was writing fire on her skin, not a fire of destruction, but one of warmth, of life, of a home being built in the wilderness. He leaned his head back slightly, and his lips found hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question, a soft exploration. It was tentative and full of a quiet awe. He pulled back a fraction of an inch, his eyes searching hers in the flickering firelight. She did not hesitate. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a clear and conscious signal of her choice. It was all the answer he needed. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of deep, soul-shaking certainty, a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and silent fears, of gratitude and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a kiss that sealed a pact made in a storm cellar and forged in the fire of danger and deceit. It was the taste of coming home. When they finally broke apart, the morning sun was cresting the eastern hills, flooding the valley with golden light. They did not speak. They did not need to. They sat side by side, her hand still in his, and watched the new day be born. They had found their place, not in a grand house or on a small farm, but here, on this rocky knoll. With each other, they would face what was coming, but they would face it together. The sound reached them first, a faint, rhythmic drumming that grew steadily louder. A rider was coming, pushing his horse hard up the slope toward them. Colt recognized the steady seat and the fine bay horse. It was Tom Wilkins. The foreman did not waste time with pleasantries. He reined in his horse, his face grim, his chest heaving from the hard ride. He held out a folded piece of official-looking paper. "This just came from town, boss," he said, his voice strained. "Delivered by the sheriff's deputy." Colt took the paper. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned the formal, legal script, the official seal of Dustwater County. His face hardened, the brief peace of the morning wiped away, replaced by a cold, familiar fury. "What is it?" Maybelline asked, her voice tight with a new fear. He looked at her, his blue eyes turning to chips of ice. "It is a summons," he said, his voice flat and hard. "From the county council. There is to be a hearing, to determine my mental competence." He folded the paper with a sharp, angry crack. "It is for tomorrow." The ride back from the knoll was a descent into a war zone. The peace of the morning was a fragile, shattered memory. The ranch house, when it came into view, no longer looked like a fortress of wealth. It looked like the enemy's command post. Every window was a suspicious eye, every shadow a potential ambush. The air itself seemed thick with conspiracy. They spent the rest of the day in a state of tense, focused preparation. Colt sent Tom Wilkins into town with a message for a lawyer, but knew it was a long shot. The council hearing was less than 24 hours away. There was no time to build a proper legal defense. Their only hope was the truth, and their only weapon was the evidence they had already found. That night, a profound restlessness seized Maybelline. Sleep was an impossibility. While Colt paced the length of the grand hall like a caged lion, his mind grappling with a life that was both his and not. She felt a pull toward the one place in the house that held tangible answers, the office. There had to be more. The ledgers they had seen were recent, covering the last few years, but a ranch this old, a dynasty this powerful, would have records stretching back decades. She took a lantern and slipped into the dark, silent office. The room smelled of Colt's lingering frustration and the dry, papery scent of deceit. The 3 ledgers Emmett had provided sat on the desk, a neat stack of lies. She ignored them. Her gaze swept the room, searching for something out of place, something old. In the corner, behind a tall filing cabinet, was a low, heavy door she had not noticed before. A storage vault. It was unlocked. Inside was a cramped, windowless space, a crypt of forgotten history. Stacks of old account books, tied with faded ribbon, lined the shelves. Most were covered in a thick layer of dust. She began pulling them down, one by one, her lantern casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. The records were meticulous, detailing cattle sales from the 1860s, grain prices from before the railroad came through. Every transaction that had built the McCrae empire. She worked for hours, her fingers growing black with dust and old ink. And then she found it, at the very back of the lowest shelf, tucked away as if by a person who both wanted to hide it and preserve it, was a ledger unlike the others. It was not bound in fine leather, but in simple, sturdy calf skin, and the whole volume was wrapped in a protective layer of oiled canvas, making it resistant to water and time. It felt different, It felt important. She unwrapped it carefully. The pages were filled with a spidery, elegant script that she recognized from the older books. It was the handwriting of Colt's father. This ledger was from the last 5 years of the old man's life. As she turned the pages, she saw a different story from the one told in Emmett Kessler's neat columns. Here were entries about providing seed on credit to struggling homesteaders after a drought, notations about forgiving debts after a bad winter, small acts of community support woven into the fabric of the business. Tucked into the back of this honest book was a folded deed of sale. It was for a small parcel of land, the Miller place, which bordered the McCrae Ranch to the north. The Millers had been forced to sell a year before Colt's father passed away. The deed was signed by the old man, but something was wrong. Maybelline held the lantern closer. She had spent hours looking at the elder McCrae's signature. She knew its loops, its confident slant. This signature was a near-perfect copy, but it was too perfect. It lacked the slight tremor, the faint weariness that had begun to creep into the old man's hand in his final year. It was the signature of a strong, healthy man imitating an aging one. It was a forgery. And the witness signature, clear and bold at the bottom of the page, was that of Emmett Kessler. The purchase price listed was insultingly low. Emmett had not just been stealing supplies. He had been stealing land, using a forged signature of a dying man. The hearing room in the Dustwater County Courthouse was paneled in dark oak that had absorbed a century of grim pronouncements. The 5 men of the county council sat at a raised bench, their faces stern, their collars stiff. They were ranchers and merchants, the pillars of the community, men who understood the language of power and money far better than the language of the heart. The room was crowded, filled with the curious and the concerned from town. Maybelline saw Martha Pike in the front row, her face alight with smug anticipation. Emmett Kessler was the picture of sober concern. He presented his case with a quiet, regretful authority. He spoke of Colt's erratic behavior since the accident, his wild accusations, his strange fixation on the widow he had brought into the house. He produced papers. Financial projections he claimed showed Colt's new plans would bankrupt the ranch. He even brought forth a witness, a nervous, watery-eyed, distant cousin of the McCraes, who mumbled a story about Colt not recognizing him last week and speaking of strange lights in the sky. It was a carefully crafted performance designed to paint Colt as a man whose mind was dangerously unstable. When it was Colt's turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. He stood, not before the council, but turning to face the people gathered in the room. He looked at the faces, some hostile, some curious, some afraid. He did not have a sheaf of papers. He had only himself. "I cannot tell you about the man I was 2 months ago," he began, his voice clear and steady, filling the silent room. "That man is a stranger to me. I cannot argue about the business decisions he made, or the people he knew. That life is a locked room, and I am still looking for the key." He paused, and his eyes found Maybelline, who was sitting in the second row with Tom Wilkins. He looked directly at her. "But I can tell you this. When I was a nameless man bleeding in a field, with a storm coming that could tear the world apart, one person did not see a stranger or a burden. She saw a human life. She risked her own livelihood to drag me to safety." He then turned his gaze to the council, his eyes hard as flint. "I have been told that I am unstable, that I am making wild accusations. The only thing I know for sure is this. I trust the woman who saved my life more than I trust the men who have been lining their pockets from my father's legacy." He sat down. The silence was absolute. Then the council chairman, a man with a great white mustache, cleared his throat. "Miss Crane, you have asked to present evidence." All eyes turned to Maybelline as she walked to the front of the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She was no longer just a homesteader. She was the keeper of a truth that needed to be spoken. She placed the 3 ledgers Emmett had provided on the table. Then, next to them, she placed the old, oilskin-wrapped book. "These are the books Mr. Kessler has been keeping," she said, her voice clear and direct. She opened one to a page detailing supply purchases. "And this is the ledger kept by Colt's father in his final years." She opened the old book. "The numbers do not match. The spirit of them does not match." She did not use legal terms. She spoke plainly. She pointed out the inflated prices, the ghost employees. She told them about Mr. Henderson's water pump. She held up the forged deed. "This is supposed to be the signature of a dying man," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But it is the signature of a strong man, a greedy man." Emmett Kessler leaped to his feet. "This is an outrage. This woman is a nobody, a fortune hunter influencing a sick man." "She is telling the truth," a voice boomed from the back of the room. Tom Wilkins strode forward, his weathered face set in grim lines. He stood beside Maybelline, a solid, immovable presence. "I was foreman of that ranch for 15 years under the old man. After he passed, Mr. Kessler here started changing things. He hired his own people in the office. He told me Mr. Colt wanted to modernize, that I should focus on the horses and leave the books to the new experts. He locked me out. He pushed me aside because he knew I would recognize his thievery for what it was." The room erupted in murmurs. The council members leaned together, whispering urgently. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony undeniable. The chairman banged his gavel. "The council has reached a decision," he announced, his voice grave. "The petition for conservatorship is denied. Furthermore, in light of this testimony and evidence, this council orders the county sheriff to open a full investigation into the financial affairs of the McCrae holdings, under the management of Mr. Emmett Kessler." Two deputies moved toward the foreman. Kessler's face had turned a mottled shade of red and white, his composure shattered, replaced by a sputtering, panicked rage. "You cannot do this. I am a respected man in this county." The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs being latched echoed through the silent room, as the deputies led a protesting Emmett Kessler away. Maybelline saw Josephine rise from her seat in the front row. She did not look at Colt. She did not look at anyone. Her face was a pale, blank mask. She smoothed the front of her dark dress, turned with a quiet, unshakable dignity, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. The room began to empty, buzzing with the news. People crowded around Tom, clapping him on the back. A few offered hesitant, respectful nods to Colt. The battle was over. The truth had won. Amid the noise and the shifting crowd, Colt's eyes found Maybelline's. He did not move toward her. He just looked at her from across the room, a look of profound gratitude, of awe, of a deep and unsettling uncertainty. The enemy was vanquished. The liars were exposed. They had won. But as the noise of the crowd faded to a dull roar in her ears, a single, terrifying question settled in her heart. They had won. But what happened now? How were two people from two different worlds, brought together by a storm and a crime, supposed to build a life in the quiet aftermath of the victory? The victory was a quiet, hollow thing. They returned to the McCrae ranch not in triumph, but in a kind of weary truce with the world. The great house was the same, yet utterly changed. Josephine was gone. She had packed a single bag and had been taken to the train station by a silent driver, leaving behind a lifetime of curated order. Her absence was a palpable presence, a vacuum that made the ticking of the grand hall clock sound louder, more mournful. The house, stripped of its hostile guardian, felt not welcoming, but simply empty. A vast museum of a life Colt could not remember and Maybelline did not want. For a week, Colt moved through the rooms like a ghost. The defeat of Emmett Kessler had not brought his memory flooding back. Instead, it had opened a door to a new and more profound responsibility. He spent his days in the office, but he did not look at the fraudulent ledgers of his foreman. He studied the old, oilskin-wrapped book, the one his father had kept in his final years. He read it not as a balance sheet, but as a map to the soul of a man he had only remembered as hard and demanding. Here, in the spidery script, was a different story. A quiet compassion, a sense of duty to the land and the people who worked it. He was discovering his father, and in doing so, he was discovering the man he wanted to be. At the end of the week, he called a meeting. He did not summon the tenant farmers to the grand house. He rode out to their farms, meeting them on their own porches, in their own modest kitchens, with Tom Wilkins at his side. He laid out his plan. He spoke of the Storm Relief Fund first, a pool of McRae money set aside to help any family in the county rebuild after a natural disaster, with decisions made by a board that included Tom and 2 other smallholders. Then, he spoke of the land. To the families who had worked the same plots for generations, he offered new deeds, not leases, but ownership. He was carving off parcels from his own vast holdings, giving the land to the people whose sweat had made it fertile. He was not giving it away. He was giving it back. The farmers listened, their faces etched with a disbelief that slowly, cautiously, turned to a dawning, tearful hope. He was dismantling an empire to build a community. He was redefining power not as the act of holding on, but as the courage to let go. The books, he assured them, would be open. Tom Wilkins was now the general manager of the entire operation, and the ledgers would be available for public inspection at the courthouse every quarter. The reign of secrets was over. During all of this, Maybelline lived in a strange limbo. She refused to move back into the grand house, staying instead in a small, clean room in the bunkhouse that was reserved for guests. She was respected by the ranch hands, treated with a quiet deference, but she felt like a visitor from another country. She was in Colt's world, but not of it. The grand house, with its polished wood and silent servants, was a constant reminder of the woman who had tried to poison her, of a class system that had judged her and found her wanting. She could not build a future in a place haunted by such ghosts. One evening, Colt found her sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse, watching the last light fade from the sky. The air was cool and carried the scent of hay and horses. "I have made a decision," she said, before he could speak. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I cannot stay here. Colt, not in this house. It is not my home." He sat down beside her, the wood groaning under his weight. He did not argue. He had seen the shadows in her eyes whenever she looked toward the main house. "I know," he said. "It is not my home either. It is my father's monument. I am not even sure it was his home." "Then what will we do?" she asked, the question hanging in the twilight air between them. He looked toward the dark, rolling hills to the west. "We will build one," he said, "a real one. A home is not something you inherit, is it? It is something you make." He looked at her, his eyes full of the morning they had shared. "I know a place, high up, with a good view of the valley." Her heart gave a lurch of recognition and joy. "The knoll," she whispered. They started the next day. They did not hire a crew of carpenters from town. They did the work themselves, with Tom Wilkins and a few other hands helping when they could. They rode up to the rocky knoll each morning, the place of their first true connection, and began to lay the foundations of their new life. The work was hard, physical, and deeply satisfying. They cleared the ground, quarried stone from the hillside for the foundation, and felled pine trees from a grove on the north slope for the walls. The air on the knoll was filled with the rhythmic thud of Colt's hammer driving spikes into wood, the sharp scrape of Maybelline's trowel smoothing mortar, and more often, the sound of their shared laughter. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, their movements a well-practiced dance. He would lift a heavy beam into place, and she would be there to steady it. She would mark a board for cutting, and his saw would follow the line with perfect precision. They were not just building a house, they were building a partnership, a trust that was mortared into the very stones of the foundation. One afternoon, Maybelline took a break from mixing mortar and began to turn the soil in a patch of earth near the front of the half-built cabin. It was a sunny spot, protected from the wind by a granite boulder. She had brought a small bundle with her, wrapped in burlap. She knelt and began to plant small, silvery green shoots in the dark, rich earth. "What is that?" Colt asked, walking over, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "Lavender," she said, pressing the soil firmly around a fragile stem. "My mother always said it was for healing, for peace in a house." He knelt beside her, his large frame looking awkward next to the delicate plants. He watched her hands, so capable and gentle, as she brought life to this rocky, wind-swept piece of land. He felt a wave of love for her so powerful it almost stole his breath. He had no memory of loving anyone before, but he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than memory, that this feeling was the only thing that truly mattered. Weeks turned into a month. The walls of the cabin were up, the roof beams laid bare against the vast Kansas sky. It was beginning to look like a home. One hot afternoon, they were setting fence posts for a small paddock for the horses. Colt would swing the heavy sledgehammer, driving the posts deep into the earth with powerful, grunting blows. Maybelline would hold the post steady, then check it with a level. He finished driving a post and leaned on the handle of the sledgehammer, breathing heavily, watching her. She was not looking at the post. She was standing very still, her head tilted slightly, with a strange, secretive smile on her face. Her hand, the one not holding the level, had come to rest gently on her lower abdomen. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough. "Is the post crooked?" She shook her head slowly, her smile widening. She did not say a word. She just looked at him, her eyes shining with a light he had never seen before, and pressed her hand a little more firmly against her belly. Understanding dawned on him, a slow, seismic wave of impossible joy. The sledgehammer, so heavy and powerful a moment before, slipped from his grasp and thudded silently into the soft dirt. He stared at her hand, at the place where a new life was beginning, a life born not of legacy or inheritance, but of a love that had survived a storm. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet. He buried his face in her hair, his whole body trembling. He could not speak. There were no words for the emotion that filled him, an overwhelming mix of terror and awe, and a love so fierce it felt like it could reshape the world. He finally lowered her to the ground, but he did not let her go. He pressed his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. He looked into her shining eyes. "3 hearts," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. 3 hearts under one roof. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, while the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The house was not finished. The walls were still bare wood, the windows empty squares that looked out onto the valley. A light evening breeze began to stir, whispering through the unfinished frame of their home. It was the same prairie wind that had brought the tornado, the same wind that had howled with such destructive fury. But now, standing on their own land, sheltered in the arms of each other, it was no longer a thing to be feared. It was just the wind, a gentle promise of the changing seasons, a quiet breath across the face of their new beginning. By late autumn, the cabin on the knoll was complete. It was not a grand house, not a monument to wealth, but it was solid and true, built of pine logs that still smelled faintly of the forest. Its windows looked out over the entire valley, a constant reminder of the world they had chosen to build, not the one they had been given. The wind that swept across the high prairie was a constant companion, but it was a clean wind now, a wind that spoke of open spaces and new beginnings, not of destruction. As the sun sank below the western horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the plains, the first lamp was lit inside the new house. Its flame was a small, unsteady flicker at first. Then it grew into a warm, steady glow that pushed back the gathering twilight. The light shone through the new pine wood window frame, a single point of warmth in the vast, darkening landscape. Colt stood in the doorway, his shoulder leaning against the frame, watching Maybelline. She was moving about the main room, their only room for now, her movements full of a quiet, focused grace. She was not arranging furniture or sweeping the floor. She was running a soft cloth over a small wooden cradle that sat near the stone hearth. He had built it himself from the leftover pine, sanding the wood until it was as smooth as river stone. It was simple and strong, like the house, like the woman who would put their child to sleep in it, in the soft lamplight, with the promise of their future so near. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The hole in his memory no longer felt like a wound. It felt like an empty space that she, and the life they were building, had filled completely. The change was not just on their knoll. It was rippling through all of Dustwater County. When they rode into town for supplies, the atmosphere was different. The invisible walls that had once separated the powerful from the powerless were beginning to crumble. Colt was no longer seen as the unapproachable scion of the McCrae dynasty, a man set apart by his name and his wealth. He was seen as the man who had faced down his own foreman to defend the truth, the man who had given land back to the families who loved it. People greeted him on the street not with the deference owed to a landlord, but with the quiet, sturdy respect reserved for a good neighbor. They saw old Mr. Henderson in the general store, his back a little straighter, his eyes a little brighter. He was arguing cheerfully with the clerk about the price of nails, holding a new deed of ownership for his small farm, a document he had never dreamed he would possess. He nodded to Colt, a simple gesture that was more meaningful than any flowery speech. The justice that had been won in the courtroom was not a single dramatic event. It was 1,000 small moments of dignity restored, of hope rekindled in the quiet lives of ordinary people. That night, they sat together on the top step of their new home. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and the distant promise of snow. The lavender Maybelline had planted was dormant now, but its faint, clean scent still clung to the earth. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling the thick wool blanket they shared tighter around them both. They did not have fine furniture or polished silver. They had the wind, the scent of wood, the vast, star-filled sky, and each other. It was more than enough. He said, "This is better than any inheritance." She replied, "It is because we chose it. It is ours." He knew she was right. Every log in the wall, every stone in the hearth was a choice they had made. Every morning they woke up in each other's arms was a choice. This life was not an obligation or a legacy. It was a promise they made to each other, new every single day. He thought back to the day the world had changed, to the sickly green sky and the roar of the wind. The memory no longer brought a jolt of terror. The storm had taken so much, his memory, her home, the fragile piece of her life. But it had given them something in return. It had acted like a prairie fire, burning away the old, dead growth of secrets and lies, leaving behind a clean, fertile ground where something new and true could grow. The tornado had not been the end. It had been the violent, terrifying beginning of everything that mattered. The wind picked up, a low, mournful sigh through the pine trees. It was a sound that had once been the voice of fear. Now, it was just a lullaby for the sleeping plains. Colt looked at the single lamp glowing in their window, a tiny, defiant star against the immense darkness. From a distance, it must look like a firefly, a small, living light caught on the roof of the world. It was a beacon, a signal to any lost soul who might be wandering in the night. It was the light of a home, not a home that was inherited or stolen, but one that was built, plank by plank and stone by stone, with hands, with trust, and with a quiet, enduring love that had proven to be the softest and most unyielding form of justice. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help us reach more listeners.